which is a museum in Washington, D.C. The cottage itself looks like this, and it's a place that Lincoln lived for 3 summers while he was the president. As we move through the program, I am going to ask my sort of teachers and educators on your side if you can help me call on folks. And I'd like to start with just getting a read of the room. If somebody from Salisbury can tell me what's something you already know about Abraham Lincoln.
Quickly. Something you know about Abraham Lincoln. Nice and loud.
Something I know about Abraham Lincoln is that he led the Civil War and everything, and he died he got shot a month and I think a half about when he was president. About a month
Yes,
and a half.
thank you for sharing. Nice work, y'all. Abraham Lincoln was president during the Civil War, and he was living here at the cottage while he was the president, but only during the summer. So he and his family would move all their stuff up here at the beginning of the summer, and then at the end of the year, kind of in October, they would leave and go back to the White House. And the whole time, Lincoln was going back and forth between the cottage and the White House while he was living up here during the summer. You also mentioned that Lincoln was killed. We'll talk about that in a second. I see somebody from South Creek has their hand up. Go ahead, South Creek.
He signed the Emancipation Proclamation?
Yeah, he came up with the Emancipation Proclamation, and he did that while he was living at the cottage. The cottage was a place where he could get some space and time to think, and the proclamation is one of the biggest ideas that he came up with while he was living up here. Those of you in Indiana, anything you already know about Lincoln? Hello? No? That's okay. So I want to talk a little bit about, somebody had mentioned earlier that Lincoln was killed. A big part of the reason that Lincoln was killed is because the person who killed him did not like that Lincoln was working on ending slavery. So that's the big complicated idea that Lincoln was working on while he was living here at the cottage. And so what we're going to talk about today is what his experience at the cottage was like and how that changed the way that he thought about what we should do about slavery, right? So first up, does everybody have a pencil or a pen and a piece of paper with them? The next thing I'm going to ask you to do is to write something down. So if you need to get that ready, please go ahead. So Lincoln came up here to the cottage because he was, it's very hot and sticky here in DC during the summer. He was living in a time with no air conditioning at all, and he and his family were looking for a place where they could get some cool, fresh air and get away from the city. And he was also president during a very complicated time during American history, and he was looking for a place where he could think about complicated things. So what I would love for you all to write down on your piece of paper is, where do you go when you have complicated things to think about, and why does that place work for you? I will put the question up so you can see it. Whoop. Real quick. Oh, sorry everybody, hang on. That's on me. I'll get my computer figured out in a second. Raise your hand if you are all set and you have something written down and you're ready to go. Okay, so let's say, Farmington, would you like to share your answer with us, please?
I like to go on a walk because it gives me a clear headspace and lets me be in a new environment.
Yeah, and when you go on a walk, are you usually outside, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I like to think of that as similar to Lincoln's commute, right? He would go out of his house, he would go through a new environment, and he had a half an hour every day where he was commuting back and forth, where he could get some of that headspace that you're talking about. What about Salem? Is there somebody from Salem who would like to share their answer?
You do that.
I go to my room.
I didn't hear you. Can you say again?
Go to my room
Yeah, why do you go there? What works for you about that?
because it's quiet and I can lie down.
Yeah, you get some space that's just your space, right? You just get a place where nobody else is going to be. Maybe you get some retreat from the other things around you. And I think the cottage was that kind of place for Lincoln. South Creek, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead.
I like to go in my bed because I can get under the covers and I can just think about stuff.
Are you sort of like pretending the rest of the world doesn't exist while you're down there? Yeah, so I think Lincoln might have been hoping for the same thing, but when he got out here to the cottage, there was a lot of stuff happening around him that meant he couldn't forget quite as much as he might have liked, right? He was looking for peace and quiet, he was looking for a sanctuary, but at the same time, he got closer to the war and to the situation when he came out here to the cottage as well. What we like to talk about the cottage as is as a home for brave ideas, as a place where Lincoln could get some of that space and time to think about the big complicated things he was working on, like the Emancipation Proclamation and its connections to what to do about slavery. So I promise this time I'm going to get my computer sorted out correctly so that I can show you a mural of President Lincoln's cottage, which has it's like an artistic rendering of the things that, there we go. Can everybody see that okay? Can I get a thumbs up? You're good, you can see it? Excellent. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on in this mural. Lincoln is actually in here twice. Raise your hand if you can see the 2 different times Lincoln is in here. Yeah, good. So he's up in sort of the center of the mural, sitting on a horse, talking to a gentleman in a blue jacket. That person is a veteran, which is a word for somebody who used to be a soldier and is now done doing that job. And the veterans were people who had been in wars before the Civil War. Now the Civil War was happening, but they were not able to be soldiers. As you can see, that guy is missing one of his legs. And Lincoln and his family were staying in the cottage, which is the building with the reddish roof there, sort of center background. And the veterans were living in the big castle-shaped building next door. And that meant they were Lincoln's neighbors, and there were people he could talk to about their experience, and he was aware of what might be happening with them. Can I get somebody from Salisbury, maybe? Can you raise your hand and tell me something else you see in the mural or a question that you have about it?
Why did he choose that house out of any other house?
Oh, that's a great question. He was invited. The veterans, the retirement home that was on the grounds of the cottage, they invited the president to come and stay because they wanted to get his attention. They wanted him to notice them. And he came up here with his family and they were like, this is beautiful. I think the other reason they were looking for a beautiful, sort of quiet place for thinking is connected to his family. Can everybody see the family in the mural? Yes? They are down in sort of the bottom left-hand corner. Mrs. Lincoln is there in the pink dress with flowers in her hair. Lincoln is sitting next to her. That's the other place he shows up in the mural. Their pet goat, Nanny, is there as well. Tad, who is the boy standing next to Lincoln, is their youngest son, And Nanny was his pet goat who sometimes got to sleep in his bed, which I think is a little bit wild. But the other big reason the Lincolns were looking for a place like the Cottage where they could come and get some peace and quiet was because their other son, Willie, died when he was 12 years old while the family was living in the White House. So it's another big reason they wanted to get away from the White House to go somewhere else so that they could have some peace and quiet. I don't know about you all, but when I'm feeling very sad, I kind of like to be by myself for a while. I don't like to be surrounded by people. And then I like to go and talk to people that I care about. And being up at the Cottage let the Lincolns do that in relationship to their son, Willie. There's two other things connected to the war that I want to point out for you in the mural. There are some soldiers over on the left-hand side in tents. They are the soldiers of Company K. They were up here on the grounds. They were camped in tents like that. They were in the backyard. Tad was really excited to have the soldiers out back there because he wanted to be a soldier when he grew up. So you can see him there in the blue uniform just to match theirs. He was not, in fact, a real soldier, but he really wanted to be. And the soldiers became friendly with the family. You can think to yourself for a second how you would feel about having soldiers living in your backyard. For the Lincolns, it had some pluses and some minuses. The other thing that was directly related to the war that you can see in the mural is the cemetery, which is all the way over on the right-hand side under the trees with orange leaves. And that is the first national cemetery. Raise your hand if you guys have heard of Arlington Cemetery. Yes? Okay, so this cemetery was there before Arlington Cemetery. This cemetery filled up with people who had died in the war, and then they started Arlington Cemetery because they had run out of space. So this cemetery, Lincoln could see from the front door of his house. Thoughts from anybody about how you think that might have changed how Lincoln thought about the war? Give me a hand if you've got an idea. Somebody from Salem has their hand up in the back. Yeah.
It would have shown him exactly how many people were dying.
Yeah, do you think he would have thought it was his fault?
Partially.
Right, I think it would be hard to say. There might be some days where he thought it was his fault and other days where he felt like it wasn't his fault, but he had to figure out something he could do about it. And that influenced the way that Lincoln thought about what to do about the war, and therefore what to do about slavery. The other thing I want to point out in the mural is way in the back, right in front of the Cottage, there is a woman in a green dress talking to a soldier. That woman is named Mary Williams. She was African American and she was working as the cook for the Lincolns. She was free the whole time she was working for them, but we don't know whether she was born free or enslaved. We just don't have that information about her right now. And she was not only friendly with the soldiers, she would bring them Lincoln's leftover breakfast. I don't know how y'all would feel about eating leftover presidential breakfast, but the soldiers were really excited about it. And Mary Williams and Lincoln's other African-American staff member, William Slade, were both two free African-Americans who were in and around Lincoln in his daily life while he was at the Cottage. And I can't say that they are the reason he thought slavery was wrong or anything like that, but I am sure that William Slade advocated with Lincoln that black men should be allowed to serve in the army the same as white guys. So we know they had conversations, and some of them were around issues related to the war. Any questions about the mural or things you see in it before we move on?
It looks like we have a question in our chat box.
Okay.
What is the pink house in the top left corner?
Yeah, great. That house is now called Quarters 1, and it was a house that was built for administrators of the retirement home. So it's connected to the retirement home campus. Indiana, I saw you had a question as well.
why is Lincoln on there twice?
Yeah, I think it's a choice of the artist, right? Obviously, there were not two Lincolns. He did not have a twin or anything, but I think the artist was trying to show the variety of things that Lincoln might be able to do or be around while he was up here at the cottage. Good question. Salisbury, do you have a question as well?
Their son.
Yeah.
How? Because their son was the son that died. Because he was 12, did he die in the war?
Oh, good question. No, he did not die in battle or because of the war. He died of a disease called typhoid fever, which you get from drinking water that has been polluted. And at that time, they did not have any medicine for that disease, so it was very scary when people got it. Tad and Willie actually both got sick, but only Tad ever got better. Willie only got worse, and then he died of the disease. So it was a really tragic event for their entire family.
We have one other question in the chat box, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
South Creek wanted to know, do the roses represent the brother that died?
Oh, not to my knowledge, but that's a great question, and I think it's a lovely thought. What Mrs. Lincoln said about coming to the cottage was, she said, when we are in sorrow, quiet is very necessary to us. And I think Willie's death especially hit the family hard because this was the second son of theirs who had died. So they, rather than making that easier, it sort of added on top of the grief they were already experiencing. Yeah.
It looks like Hempfield has a question. Hempfield, go ahead.
I was wondering, because the reason why there are two Abraham Lincolns is because he did so much around. If the artist wanted to represent that, why didn't they make multiple, like more than that? To show
Like
how
infinite Abraham Lincolns?
Well, like 3 or 4, I don't know, just more than 2.
Yeah, I don't know. That would be, I think that would also be interesting, right? As a mural, to be like, here are the 12 different things Lincoln did while he was here. But my understanding about this artist is that he was hoping to sort of give an impression, and not, but I think you're right that there are lots of different ways he could have done that. Yeah. Okay, excellent. So all of these things that were around Lincoln here at the cottage had the opportunity to influence his thinking as he tried to figure out, what do we do about slavery? The summer of 1862 was the first summer he was in residence up here at the cottage, and he spent that whole summer thinking about his ideas. In July, he showed his idea to his cabinet, his team of advisors. There was some conversation about that. They decided to move forward with it. And then in September, Lincoln put out a preliminary version, like a test version of the Emancipation Proclamation. And what that said was it gave the Confederate States, which had left the country and said, we want to start our own country and we want to keep slavery. So Lincoln, in the preliminary proclamation, said back to them, you have 100 days to peacefully come back. If you come back into the country, you can keep all the people you've enslaved. Slavery can be the same as it was before. And then if you don't come back inside those 100 days, everyone you have enslaved will become free. So it was kind of an offer and kind of a challenge at the same time, right? Like a or else. So then he waited 100 days, and since nobody really took him up on his offer, the full proclamation took effect in January when that 100-day deadline expired. Here's the beginning of it says, Whereas on the 22nd day of September, in the year of our Lord, 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States containing, among other things, the following, which is a very complicated way of saying, remember what I said in September? Now it is going to happen. South Creek, I see you have a question.
Why are all the soldiers wearing blue in the painting?
Because they're all Union soldiers. They are all on Lincoln's side of the war, and that was the color of their uniforms. So, he says, remember what I said in September? Now it's actually going to happen. Do I have a volunteer who would be comfortable reading something out loud for us that's a little bit long? Okay. I saw South Creek go up first, actually. Somebody's hand shot right up into the air. Give me a second. I will pull it up for you so that you can read it. South Creek, go ahead. Loud and clear, please, so everybody can hear you.
That on the first day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, and the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward forever free.
Yes? Did that track, South Creek? You look like you have a question about it. No? Okay. So, my friend in Indiana, can you sort of parse for us what that whole first part is through that on the first day through 63? What does that mean?
That means January 1st, 1863.
Right. You're like, it's January 1st, 1863. Now is when that's going to happen. Okay. Farmington, can I ask you to parse the next piece for me? All persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state. The people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States. Like, where is that actually talking about?
The whole country?
Yeah, so it kind of seems like any state at all. But Lincoln's clarification on it is the people, where the people are in rebellion. So that means only Confederate states. It did not apply to Union states that still held slaves. So for example, Maryland is an example of that. Missouri is an example of that. So it was pretty careful and particular about that. Can somebody in Salem, can you let me know why you think Lincoln put the word forever in here?
He didn't want them to, after he had died, start holding slaves again.
Yeah, right? This is one of my favorite stories about the proclamation. At some point during that conversation with his cabinet, the cabinet member, there's a specific cabinet member of Lincoln's who crossed out the word forever. And in the final version, Lincoln put it back in, so by way of saying, like, this is an important part of this, right? And I think that's the piece of it that many people who heard about the proclamation when they were enslaved found really inspiring and hopeful, because they could imagine a future that would be themselves and their families forever free. I want to show you all this as well, in case it's helpful in understanding the proclamation. So the proclamation, let's back up. The green states on top, those are Union states where slavery had ended before the war. So Illinois, California, New York, slavery had ended before the war in all those places. The yellow states in the middle, like I said, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, those are states that had slavery but did not join the Confederacy. And then the pink states on the bottom are states that had slavery and left to join the Confederacy. So the proclamation only freed people in the pink states. Everybody in the yellow states who had been enslaved stayed enslaved. Yeah. Questions about the proclamation so far? I know there was a lot of information. No? Great.
It looks like actually South Creek has a question. South Creek, go ahead.
All right. Yeah, South Creek, go ahead.
How come they only freed the enslaved in the pink states, not the yellow?
Because at this time, Lincoln thought that he wasn't allowed to do that as the president, right? He thought that because those yellow states were still in his part of the country, that he couldn't take their property just without asking them. Later, he changed his mind about that and did work to end slavery in those states. But in the middle, when he was working on the proclamation, he only freed people in some places. I know there was a second question in South Creek, but I'm gonna go to Indiana first, and then if you still have questions after, we'll go back. Indiana, go ahead.
How did Lincoln enforce the Emancipation Proclamation?
That's a great question. It was really hard for him to do. The people who ended up making the proclamation actually happen sort of in two ways. One, the Union Army, when it went in and took over territory, it could make sure people were free there. And two, the people who were enslaved, when they heard about the proclamation, started enforcing it themselves. They would leave, they would go to Union troop lines or come here to Washington, D.C., which was free territory, and they thought they could be safer, right? So that was a question, I think it's a great question because it was a question people had for Lincoln at the time. They were like, well, what are you gonna actually do about it, right? I think it's a great question. South Creek, go ahead.
Who is Bacon at the top of the map?
Oh, great. Bacon is the person who made the map. Making maps at that time was extremely difficult. So if you had done it and you wanted to sell it to other people, you wanted people to know it was yours. Any other questions about the proclamation? Sort of.
In our chat box, it asks, when did the slaves in the yellow states become free? Or when were they allowed to go?
What a great segue. That's the next thing I want to talk about, which is called the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So the Emancipation Proclamation, as we so carefully looked at earlier, was January 1st, 1863. The 13th Amendment happened in December of 1865. So almost 3 years it took for those other people to officially become free. Some of them left and escaped in the meantime anyway, but officially they became free in December of 1865. And the 13th Amendment was something Lincoln had worked on in the last sort of months of his presidency before he was killed. He knew that the proclamation was only partially an answer, and he thought that it would be, in order to make this change really, really stick, it would need to get into the Constitution. And so he got the amendment through Congress, but then the next step for an amendment is it has to be ratified by states. So Lincoln got it through Congress, and then he was killed, and then several months later, the amendment was ratified and became official. But all told, it's about 4 million people that the proclamation freed in those pink states, and about another 500,000 that were in those yellow states that were freed by the amendment. The other thing the amendment did was it made it a lot harder for a later president to issue another proclamation that just undid all of Lincoln's work, right? And one of the things I find really moving about that is that Lincoln did not get to see the results of his work. He didn't ever get to know that the 13th Amendment was going to happen. And that means what he's done for us, as the proclamation was a partial step, the 13th Amendment was a partial step, and if there's still work to be done, we are the ones who are going to do it, right? One of my favorite examples of Lincoln speaking about what America could be like goes something like this. It is in order that each of you may may have through this free government, which we have enjoyed, an open field and a fair chance for your industry, enterprise, and intelligence. That you may all have equal privileges in this race of life with all its desirable human aspirations. The nation is worth fighting for to secure such an inestimable jewel. Which is a way of saying the United States should be a place where people can decide what they want to do with their life. It should be a place where their skills can serve them well. It should not be a place where people are enslaved and do not ever get to decide what they want to be when they grow up. It should be a place where people are free to hope for whatever they like. And part of what Lincoln was saying here is, and that's the thing that's worth fighting for. Everybody still has their piece of paper, yes? I have another question for you. What I would like for you to write on your piece of paper, you can write it on the bottom or on the other side if you feel like it, is Lincoln was working on solving this big, complicated problem of slavery. What is your brave idea for making the world better? Take a second to think about it and a moment to write it down. South Creek, I see you have a question. Go ahead.
No, it's not a question. I would shut down nuclear and coal power plants and replace them with more clean energy. And the workers from those power plants will be transferred to more clean energy.
Awesome. So what I love about that idea is that it is a big, complicated idea, right? And that's part of what I mean by brave. I think this idea is awesome. Do you think there are people in the world who would think it was not awesome? Yeah? Do you think you would have to convince some people along the way? And that's what I mean by brave, right? You have this idea that you're gonna make happen, even though it might be a little bit hard. All right, anybody else want to share their idea? Indiana, go ahead. And then Salem, you're next.
I would resolve all the wars.
That's awesome. That's incredibly complicated, and I cannot wait to see you make that happen. Salem, go ahead.
Make everything a dollar because think that stores would make more money.
Can you say that a little bit more loudly? I couldn't hear you.
Make everything a dollar.
I'm sorry, I can't hear it.
I think make everything a dollar.
Make everything a dollar. Oh, yeah, by way of redistributing how much people will need to pay to get the things they need. Nice, okay. Salisbury, are you ready? Go ahead.
More affordable for poor people.
What do you want to make more affordable? I missed the beginning.
Food and houses.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Farmington, go ahead.
Stop global warming.
Okay, maybe you can work with our friend who has questions about nuclear power. Yeah, South Creek, you're next.
I would try to clean up some beaches, like to get out the trash and try to save some endangered species.
Awesome. Okay. Go ahead, South Creek. I see you have another person, and then Salem, you're next.
I think Galileo's next too after that. Just put them
Oh,
up.
I can't see Galileo on my screen, but Galileo, why don't you go first then?
Go ahead, Galileo. Do you have something to add? We can't hear you, Galileo, but feel free to use the chat box. South
Yeah,
Creek?
Therese. Yeah, South Creek, go ahead.
I want to make the world more environmentally friendly and not like pollution.
Nice. Okay, Salem, I saw a hand there.
Make more self-support.
Okay. Right? I feel like this is really exciting for me. I mean, it's exciting for me to hear your ideas. It's exciting for me to think about all of the big changes that we could be making in the world. And for me, Lincoln is really an example of that, is that he was not waiting to have all of the answers to a problem before he started working on it. The proclamation only freed some of the people who were enslaved, but that turned out to be a starting point, a foundation on which those people and many other people have been able to build. So if you are working on a big, complicated problem, I would encourage you, like Lincoln, to think of it in smaller pieces. And I'm confident you can all make a difference on the problem that you care about the most. I am all set on my end. I do have a little bit more time for questions. If people have questions about Lincoln or about the cottage, I will keep my expert hat on and you can ask me questions, yeah? Yeah, Indiana, go ahead.
You were saying when Willie died of typhoid fever, he was the first son to die, or the second son to die. Who was the first one?
Yeah, so the Lincolns had 4 sons. Their names were Robert, Edward, Willie, and Tad. So Edward died when he was about 2 years old, before the family moved to Washington, D.C., when they were living in Springfield, Illinois. And then Willie died when they got to Washington, D.C. So here at the cottage, it was just Tad and Robert. Except Robert was mostly away at college, so a lot of the time Tad was at the cottage by himself. Then their father was killed. And then Tad also died before he got to be an adult. So it's just Robert who made it to adulthood of the 4 Lincoln sons.
Hempfield has a question. Hempfield, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead, Hempfield.
Answers?
Go ahead. Go.
I read about this, but I read a book about Abraham Lincoln and his childhood, and I don't know if you know, like, or not, but it was saying that when he was a teenager, he wrestled and he went 52-0. He never lost a match. And I was wondering.
I don't know the specific numbers, but I can confirm that Lincoln was an excellent wrestler. Sometimes people ask me whether he played basketball, because of course he was a very tall person. He was 6'4", which is still the tallest person to ever be president. But basketball had not been invented when he was alive, so he never got the chance to play. Yes, Salisbury, go ahead. I think your volume is off, Salisbury. Try again.
Did they bury Abraham Lincoln at like a railroad, like near a railroad? Or...
Did he have a railroad? He definitely used them.
She asked if he was buried by one. Do you know where Abraham Lincoln was buried?
Oh, yeah. So I think you might be making a connection to the fact that Lincoln died here in Washington, D.C., and then his coffin, his body, was put on a train on its way back home to Springfield, Illinois. And at all the train stops, everybody would come to see him and to mourn and to appreciate him. So the train took kind of a long time to get back to Springfield. Yeah. South Creek, go ahead.
Is Lincoln's cabin in Washington, D.C. still there today?
Yes. So I want to clarify 2 things. The cabin that he lived in when he was a little kid is in Kentucky, and that's not us. This cabin, the cottage here, is a building in Washington, D.C. that has been here the whole time. It We're super lucky. It's still here, it's still standing, and people can come to visit it. But that is why we are a museum, is because this was a special place for Lincoln, and it's still here. Okay, Salisbury, why don't you go ahead and we'll come back to South Creek.
Lincoln's family have any say in anything he did, like those slavery? Did they have any say in it?
Did they have any say in anything he did?
Yeah.
I would say the person in his family who had the most say in what he did was Mary Lincoln, who he was married to. She was his wife. And she was really supportive. They supported each other, especially before Lincoln became president. They started they built their life into what they wanted it to be, and they were both incredibly ambitious. So I would say she absolutely did. I would say he thought about his children when making decisions too. So Robert, the oldest boy, wanted to join the army really, really badly. And Lincoln knew that it wasn't fair for him to keep his son safe while other people's sons were dying. But also, Mrs. Lincoln was terrified that her third son would die. And so Lincoln was balancing those two things. And then Tad Lincoln kind of got to do whatever he wanted. He could interrupt the president, his father, in meetings. He climbed all over things. He let his goat sleep in the house. So he really did not have a lot of rules in his life. South Creek, we're coming back to you.
Back in the painting, do you know what book Abraham was holding?
I don't know if he's holding a specific book in the painting. I do know reading was a huge part of his life and something he enjoyed very much. One of the things he liked to read for fun was plays by Shakespeare. So if you want to choose something, that's what I would choose for that. Okay, South Creek, go ahead again.
How old was Abraham Lincoln when he died?
He was 56. Yeah. All right, yeah. South Creek's lined up, go ahead.
How old was Miss Lincoln when she died?
She was quite a bit older than that. I believe she was in her 70s, but I don't have the exact age. She outlived everybody in her family except Robert. Go ahead.
Was the other brother in the painting too?
Edward is not in the painting, and neither is Robert. It's just Tad, really. Yeah. Go ahead.
When did Robert die?
Robert did not die until the 1920s, so almost 70 years after the Civil War. He lived to be a very old man. He had a bunch of different things, a bunch of different jobs in the government. Do you guys know the Lincoln Memorial in DC where the Lincoln is sitting in the big chair? Yes? So Robert got to be there when they opened that. So, yes. Okay. Yeah, South Creek.
I have heard that after Abe died that Mrs. Lincoln tried to get the spiritual part of it. Do you know if that's true?
Yeah, she actually started it before he died. She started it even when just Willie died. And I think that is, like, now we think of that as a little bit silly, right? Like, ooh, ghosts. But at that time, nobody knew anything about it. And she was really desperate to talk to her son again and to see her son again. And that was the way she was hoping to do it. Yeah. Salisbury, do you have a question? Go ahead. I don't think you have any. Yeah.
Who are Abraham Lincoln's ancestors?
We don't know a lot about his ancestors because when he was born, he was incredibly, incredibly poor and not a lot of people cared about his family. So we know his father's name was Thomas and his mother's name was Mary, and that is pretty much it. That's all we know. I'm sorry, Nancy. I've got it backwards. Salem, did you guys have a question as well? No? Okay, South Creek, go ahead.
In the painting, why was there a peacock by the house?
There were peacocks on the grounds of the house while the Lincolns were out here. They were pets, again, of Tad's, and they had these little strings on their legs that were meant to keep them from flying away. And one day they had flown up into a tree and the strings had gotten tangled, so the peacocks couldn't get down. So Lincoln had to climb the tree in order to get the peacocks down out of the tree, which I think sounds a little bit silly. Yeah. Salisbury, go ahead.
Where were Abraham Lincoln's kids buried?
Yeah, all of them except Robert are buried in the family tomb in Springfield. Robert is buried near his house that he had as a grown-up in Vermont. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, last stop for questions. I think we got one more from South Creek. South Creek, I can give you one more.
How old was Robert when he died?
Again, 70s or 80s, I don't know the exact, but he was a very, very old man. He lived a long time, which is, stands out because none of his brothers did. Yeah.
All right.
Alrighty.
Well, thank you
so much, everybody, for tuning in.
Yes, thank you for joining us. And thank you so much for your time, Joan, and for sharing all your expertise. For everyone that came today, thank you. Please check out our future sessions. And Joan, I'll see you later for our session. All right,
Thanks.
bye, everybody. Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye, thank you for the class.